Hello there. Welcome to Issue Space. We are a podcast and community for everyone who's working to save the world. We are a space for professional changemakers, whether you are working at a nonprofit, a foundation, a brand, a think tank, beyond, in politics, anywhere, to be able to come together and in community with candor, with humor, with openness, process what it's like to have a 9-to-5 that is meant to transform human life casually. I'm Kat Addo. I'm an inclusive social impact strategist and the creator of the space, the curator of these conversations, and I'm really happy that you're here. This episode of the Issue Space podcast is called The Lighter Side of Change: Joy, Levity, and Imagination in Impact Work. And I'm especially excited for this topic because I feel like I'm going to learn a lot. I am, as I just mentioned, I'm a strategist, and you're kind of trained to always root in the problem that you're trying to solve for a good reason. But it's a lot, every project that you do, every new initiative you get involved in, it's a lot of time immersing in the negatives, in the injustices, in the barriers, in the gaps, in the oppression. And again, that's kind of like our reason for being here. And so it's appropriate, but it does kind of bring the mind and the energy to a certain place. And I think a lot of us might attest that in this era where we're in kind of like an all hands on deck for the future type of moment in history. It's worth pausing and thinking about, are there opportunities to complement that groundedness and that seriousness and that immersion in the problem space with just lighter frames, expansive frames, using our minds and our time together in a different way. And I actually always think about one specific memory when I think about this topic. I was sitting with a friend, then I think still more just a colleague, now a close friend, at work. We're at a social change agency, and she was saying, none of the campaigns that we do are fun. Like, we used to do fun campaigns. We used to do like humorous campaigns. We used to do like cute campaigns, and we're not doing those anymore. And I was kind of like, well, yeah, like it's the time. I started my first day in social impact on October 31st, 2016, as in like 6 business days before we got a new president and the energy shifted. So it did not feel like the time to be, knee slapping and making wry little jokes and things like that. It was the epitome of like, oh, this is how high the stakes can get. And we talk a little bit in episode 1 about how while you don't necessarily have to be the world's most radical progressive to work in social change work, realistically, most of the initiatives and priorities that you work on in this space map more to progressive politics and more often to progressive politics than to conservative priorities. So that administration change really changed the tone, and it did feel a bit joyless. And so even though in that moment I could see really clearly, like, well, it makes sense to me why we're not running cute little quippy campaigns, it did stick with me, obviously, as I'm sharing with you today, still reflecting on it, because there are so many things, positive things that we know can come from using things like levity and humor and laughter and joy as a connection point to bring people together, to make them feel connected to one another and to what you're saying, to lower guards. How many times are you in a space or a meeting and you kind of like sprinkle a little like fun dust because it's feeling too dry, and that's the thing that gets wheels turning and gets the brainstorm going, and so I think it's a very valid point, and I'm excited to explore it with 2 wonderful professionals today. I feel like we have 2 really interesting and experienced vantage points with us to talk about what some of these lighter frames or lighter cultural contexts can really do in terms of hardcore change making. So our first guest is Jess Weiner. Jess is the founder and CEO of Talk to Jess, a consultancy, and she is basically like the thought partner for culture-minded brands who want to be sensitive about the way they show up and the cultural legacy they leave, particularly when it comes to the portrayal of women and girls, and other groups as well. But that's sort of been at the heart of Jess's work. And she's kind of like that bitch. A couple of initiatives that Jess launched that you might be familiar with, even just from the consumer space outside of work. If you know the now kind of iconic in the space Dove Real Beauty campaign, that sort of challenged beauty norms about women in a time when I think generally brands weren't really tripping over themselves to challenge norms at all. They were kind of leveraging norms to make a buck. But that was very transformative. And, that came from Jess's heart and mind. Similarly, and that was now 20 years, I think, just passed. So it's like iconic. It's in the canon of culture change work, of brand impact work. It's just one of those things. And it's notably, personal care, beauty. I think now people are sitting with the gravity of influence in that space, but not always. So I think that's very striking. And then similarly, another big one from Jess's portfolio, the sort of new Barbie, like the Barbie that young girls are introduced to today, who has a range of interests and a realistic body and a really diverse community. As opposed to the Barbie that I received in like 1988 or something, who like her only characteristic was having a bathing suit, like beautiful brown skin, but she was just in a bathing suit in a box. And like, that was her life. And that was her story. But the new Barbie comes from Jess and her team really shepherding in a new vision of this iconic portrayal of a woman in a play space. So again, a space that you could argue is lighter, is more oriented towards play and joy, but actually has become a runway for a lot of cultural change. So I'm very excited to welcome Jess. Jess, thank you for being here.
So happy to be here with you. Thank you for that lovely
Oh,
intro.
absolutely. Jess, I gave like highlights of your portfolio and professional Jess, but if there's anything you would like to share with us as you feel comfortable about just like who you are, where you're from, like who was the whole person who comes to the work, please feel welcome to.
It's always funny when I hear and I'm grateful for the work that I've done. I've been an entrepreneur for 31 years at this point. So this has been my entire trajectory, but where I started from is little Jess. So when you read some of the accolades up front, what I really think about is what made me interested in social change work. And I have a kind of a pivotal moment, I think, around 11 or 12, growing up in Miami, Florida, feeling sort of always on the periphery. I loved television and movies, and obviously back then you had to watch all the commercials, and I loved them too. I loved everything on television. But what I didn't love is I didn't see little girls who looked like me or my friends at the time, and I was struggling with body image issues. And I grew up in a very eclectic, diverse community in Miami, and yet most of the imagery that I saw was just sort of also super white, super blonde, super thin, super wealthy, which is still a predominant stereotype in our mainstream media. But even as a little kid, I loved telling stories and I loved television, and I always wondered who was in charge. I remember asking my parents, like, who makes the decisions about what we see on TV? Who made that commercial? Like, where is this coming from? And I think what that does, Kat, for me is describe the curiosity that has driven my career. Even as a little girl, it was why aren't my friends in this? Or why doesn't my family look like this family? And then from there, I think as I grew up and studied and thought about ways that I wanted to like bring myself into the work. And a really important part of my origin story is that I was a theater kid growing up. I played all the time. I mean, we made plays. I was a playwright in my young adult years. I was, loved performance, and mostly I loved improvisation. I loved, creating in the moment with other people. And all of those theatrical tenets of play and joy and storytelling and listening, because that's a huge component of the yes and in improv and adding to this space, all of that creative kid who wondered who's making all the media in the world has now become like an adult woman who's working on changing that media and has kind of unpacked some of the power dynamics of brands and advertisers and how we get that media. So I would say that's just a really important piece for me, is that I still think of like 12-year-old me who was curious and wanted to know how to make things better and had I would never have guessed that this would be where I was 30 plus years later.
Oh, wow. It's like, it's so funny because you're like, you wouldn't have guessed, but now hearing it from the outside, you have those moments where you zoom out, you're like, that's why all of that came together. Like, that's why that seed was planted, and just look at the influence you're having now. It's incredible. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. So is it safe to say that your dream job when you were a child was to be an actress?
Initially, yes, but you know what it really was, and I didn't have the word for it, Kat? It was to be a producer. I loved putting things together. I love being on a stage, and I definitely love conversations and performing to a degree. But what I loved was coming up with the idea, finding the right people and partners, and then putting that message out into the world. But I didn't have the framework to know, like, even producing was a job. And then, of course, now the work that we do, like strategy is part producing as well. You're having a problem, you're moving towards a solution. So I think my ultimate goal was, I wanted to be in charge. Whatever I was doing, I was like, I wanted to be the decision maker. I wanted to have that autonomy, which is interesting because I think I've now been an entrepreneur for 3 decades. I also didn't know that that was a possibility at that young age. But I think the charting your own course, being in control of the narrative, helping to expand it and invite other people in, that's always been in my DNA. I just didn't have like any of the creative or business framework for it when I was younger.
That's right. That's right. And I would add that ability to hold a bird's eye view, to hold a vision. Like so much of production work in any capacity, you're working towards something that the people around you might not necessarily see. And you have to believe it and get everybody else to believe in it enough to build with you, just like one brick at a time, which is
That's
very analogous to systemic change. You're not necessary. There's not like some finite thing and like, okay, you just follow like these like 8 IKEA steps and you get to where you need to go. There's always new factors. There's always unknown elements that pop up. And I think that skill of being able to hold vision and bring people together around it to build something together is really telling and really needed.
I think the other thing too, I love everything you've said, that bird's eye view, I think as a producer, as a strategist, also comes from understanding what everyone's role is to get the job done.
That's right.
I had that at an inherently young age because when you put on a play, what's the role of the set designer and the director and your fellow cast members and the musical director, if you're doing that, I had in putting lots of productions together as a kid, I also love to understand who played what role to get us there. And that for sure comes in handy right now when I'm working with multinational companies and trying to understand the connection between product design and inclusive marketing efforts and all those sorts of pieces. I can put that puzzle together.
And even zooming out, like if you think about your change power map, same thing. Like whose role is what change can they enact if we're able to reach them? Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing with us. I love these because I didn't know these things. Even though I know you, I didn't know these things. It's so cool to see and to hear. We have another wonderful conversationalist with us, April Callan. April Callan is just like one of my faves. I just love her. I'm always like bothering her, being like, we should do this, we should do that. She's like, okay, calm down. Let's talk logistics. But April is the Vice President of Racial Equity Programs and Narrative Strategy at Purpose Built Communities. And Purpose Built Communities is a nonprofit that I'm going to paraphrase. So I hope your brand people don't get mad at me, but that revitalizes neighborhoods around the United States by working with their residents to just do transformative interventions. April, when I met April, you were working at Frameworks Institute, the think tank that uses sort of like cultural insight to think about how are we going to change the narratives that are causing harm or that more neutrally are at least standing in the way of progress. And I always really appreciated that because similar to Jess's point about sometimes you stumble into the language of the work that you want to do or that you find yourself doing. For a lot of my career that always orbited around, content and communications and brand and storytelling, I didn't understand that the social impact kind of either like corollary or like amalgamation of all those things was narrative change. Like you're trying to take the harmful ideas and you're trying to beat them down and put more helpful ideas in their place. So I have a lot of respect for the work that you do. And I'm just happy that you're here. Hello.
Hi, I am happy to be here. Of course, at the admiration is mutual. Such a big fan. I remember being on some of those calls when we were figuring out how to work together and you all were doing a project. I was like, I want to be her friend. The way that I kind of just go through life, I'm always in a state of, I think as an adult and as a woman, particularly like sort of like ultimate state of joy for me is when you meet other women and you're like, I would be friends with her in middle school or elementary school. Like I can see the childlike version of myself and the childlike version of someone else. And that's what I saw in you. And so whatever iteration that our relationship sort of just takes over time, like I'm always happy to be on that journey with you.
That is so beautiful. I love that. It's like it's healing. That is
Yeah.
that what we're all doing? We're just walking around and like our first grade selves are being like, "Hi, will you play with me?"
Yeah, basically. Exactly.
Oh, that's so beautiful. Well, I want to invite you as well. I gave highlights of the work that you do, which I think is more important now than ever, when there are so many harmful narratives being made up, like admittedly, openly, unabashedly made up just to screw things up and mess with people's lives. But what might you feel comfortable sharing with us about April, the whole person, sitting beside your professional self? Anything about your background or how you thought about the world when you were younger? You're welcome to share.
Yeah, definitely. So I love also how much of a connector you are because just your story is so similar to mine. I think when I was much younger, the best or like the way I would like sort of probably capture myself is a storyteller and a connector too. And so when I was young, I didn't know exactly what stories I wanted to tell. I certainly didn't know anything about narrative or even communications, but I knew from my experiences as one, I very much identify with being an only child. As a kid, I was very shy. And so, when you are shy and you're an only child, you're often around in a space of being an observer. And you take in a lot of information and you're sort of having to sit there with yourself to kind of sort through these things that you're hearing and seeing. And so for me, growing up in the South, I'm from Atlanta or Metro Atlanta. Obviously, the South has its own sort of history. My family is from Alabama. So traveling back and forth from like big city to very small rural towns and honestly having a really lot of wonderful, beautiful experiences. And then being raised by my mother. And so being from the South, being Black, being a woman, being raised by another Black woman, I was getting all sorts of messages through TV and media, especially, this is the late 80s, early 90s, really harmful stories about Black women in single family homes. And that just did not reflect my experiences at all. And so as a kid, really trying to make sense of that. And the best I could do was think there has to be something in storytelling. And as an avid TV watcher, a big fan of PBS, as I got a little older, I was like, I'm going to be a producer. And if I can inform the stories that are being told about people like me, then maybe when people out in the world meet people like me, we will all have a much better understanding of each other and that will bring forth much better relationships. Um, and at that time, it probably still so WGBH in Boston seemed like the PBS station to be at. Like they produce so many dynamic programs. But I actually found myself in Chicago into a grad school program that really set the course for me to do this work professionally. And of course, when you believe in social change, communication, storytelling, that often leads you to nonprofits. And so my work has always been in the nonprofit space, really trying to connect between the issues that plague so many of us and trying to find the affirmative in people's humanity and their existence and letting that be the lead story rather than the harm that is often done to people, that there's so much beauty and culture and imagination, community and excitement and all of these wonderful things that just never get captured. Whether it's because of fundraising or because it helps feed some other political party's narrative or it feeds a policy decision. Like there are very intentional reasons why the stories that get told are being told. And so just consistently for wherever I am and whatever I'm doing, whatever the issue is, I'm trying to find that light side of people's experiences and bring that forth to everyone.
That's beautiful. I love the original intention of like, I just want to create understanding. Like,
Yeah.
just I just want to see myself similar to Jess. I just want to see myself portrayed accurately, respectfully, with dignity, not as a pawn in somebody else's fear mongering narrative, Yeah. Yeah.
Definitely, certainly.
Something else that like strikes me in hearing April, your story as well, and Kat, as we're learning each other and thinking about this is the seeking to understand both ourselves and the systems that are in place to keep us from ourselves and each other, right? And interesting, I think that maybe the through line between a lot of impact experts, which is obviously, I think all of it really does generate from a personal, story and a personal connect to that. But the seeking to understanding is what I think keeps us in the profession because it's not simple. And everybody, I love, you can armchair troll your way on the internet and have all your reasons of how you think you're going to solve these complex issues. But I think the humbling nature of seeking to understand is a lifelong journey. And I think for those of us in this profession, probably both challenging and I have found it like a wonderful learning experience in stretching my understanding beyond, where I grew up and how I grew up. And I think that keeps them connected, right?
Yeah, I would say informally, I've always in my roles have made sure that there's an equity component. And in this role, purpose-built communities, this is the first time that equity, specifically racial equity, is formally part of my work. And so as I think about how to share this with other folks, especially in the current political and cultural context that we live in, one of the first things I share with people is being curious about other people. So to your point, Jess, about building understanding of yourself, but also outside of you, is first and foremost, just be curious. Be in a space of asking questions and always, and sort of to that, asking questions with humility, not questions to confirm a bias or an assumption that you already have, but just being as open and curious as you possibly can be about the world around you and the people in it.
And easier said than done, because I think, human beings, we want to seek comfort and familiarity. So no matter your intentions, you can find yourself kind of making your own like IRL algorithm.
Mhm.
Like
Yeah.
I'm just going to stay in this one space. But actually kind of going down the path that you opened, April, about your work, I'm wondering if each of you can share, just like at a top level, what your work is like so that we can explore the opportunities that you've had or that you've sought or that you've fought for to introduce levity, joy, and imagination into it.
So my role as a cultural expert and brand strategist, has evolved over time in the kinds of ways that I work with and I work with big legacy brands purposefully because I will say the curiosity about the systemic barriers that cause us to feel isolated in the media that we consume. It's often a really kind of complex ecosystem of players in that space, right? And I have found that when I partner with large multinational companies that have a global presence, I get a very strong stage and platform with them to make broad impact. So I've tended to choose them as my primary partners, and then April feel very passionately that they can't do that work without boots on the ground folks who are doing this work every single day, not for a marketing moment and not for a product design moment. And so I love the marriage of those two worlds. So I would say the to make progress. And my world looks like this. Typically, I get called for two reasons, which is why I named my company 20 years ago, Talk to Jess, because this would literally be when we used to call each other. We don't do that anymore. But when people used to just like,
Too invasive.
oh my gosh, it is too invasive. But I'm a Gen Xer, so I really welcome those phone calls. But I remember getting calls and people would say things such like, oh, we have a problem with how we're representing women. And someone said I should talk to Jess. Or we have a problem with how we're talking about boys and masculinity. Somebody said I should talk to Jess. It became almost funny that because of my work in the body image and beauty space and some of the advocacy and media work that I had done, I started getting these SOS calls. So the beginning of my career, I was like a little Olivia Poping it, to be honest with you. I was getting calls with, we need to fix this. And there's this big crisis. So I was coming in at the moment of crisis a lot for brands. Sales were down, sentiment was terrible. They had, really made a big misstep. And then I was coming in as a strategist in the crisis moment to help them course correct. And then from there, we would discover potentially a new path forward. I'd say I did that for like half of my career. The calls were mostly incoming around like, help us get out of this mess, which meant, to the points everybody's raised, why and how have we offended somebody or left somebody out? Where is the lack in this moment? What didn't we think through? I mean, I will say the people who called were trying to sometimes save their butt, but a lot of times they were trying to understand a changing consumer landscape that they were clearly out of touch with, and they didn't have the right executives and lived experiences in the room, right? And so obviously I am one woman with one set of backgrounds. And so I developed skills really early on to build community and collaboration to bring in the voices that needed to be in that space. And I could use and leverage whatever power and privilege I had, both in my relationships and in standings in certain communities where I could call those folks together. So oftentimes I'd come in and kind of provide cultural context to the trends and things happening in culture after a choice had been made. What I'm proud to say I get to do now in the evolution of my career is be there at the genesis of this outreach to community, so that, like, if we would work with April Cat or with you, like, we'd be able to very early on help my brand partners understand the territory that they're looking at engaging in, have advocates and allies, that can come in and really help shape those programs before we get to commercial, to the, program, to the campaign.
Mm-hmm.
And that now has become my calling card for folks, which I feel really excited by, because I don't love armchair quarterbacking crisis moment. That does not, makes my blood pressure go up, doesn't make me passionate. What makes me passionate is matchmaking, issues related, experts and brands that want to have a deeper, long-standing conversation in this space and making that marriage together. And so for me, just that could look like a couple of things. We work a lot around translating trends in culture. We call ourselves sort of authenticity auditors. We really come in with a bench of folks who could, really give a gut check and some early advice about ways that somebody might be putting together even the brief for an agency, but also just, I'll look at campaign concepts. And obviously we build social impact programs for folks. So we get to do that from a cultural lens. The other place that we work with folks on is partnerships. And that's really what we're talking about. The relationships are the currency of business. And I have prided myself over these last 3 decades of making beautiful relationships with community leaders in spaces well beyond my own lived experience, in communities and groups that I get incredible pleasure in helping to pass the mic and amplify those spaces. And then the third thing will be in like the actual program, because one of the things I'm really cautious about, and this came from some of the crisis work, was I don't want to put a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. I really want to be able to understand, again, seek that understanding of how did we get here? What harm has been done? How do we repair that harm? And that means, like, and I'm talking more specifically like a terrible representation in a spot, or, somebody's launched a campaign that sounds like what I call SFSN, sounds fabulous, signifies nothing. Like, it just doesn't have anything there. And so what I like to do now is to be able to, build those programs that have long-standing quiet impact, like long-term commitment isn't there to be a splashy press release, is really a company or a corporate commitment to solving that problem with other professionals. So that's the kind of what my world looks like now. But it was important to tell the origin story, because I think that's where I'm really passionate about, is I want brands and organizing bodies that care about these issues to know that they have to work in a collaborative community sense, outside of their little siloed work pods, to I think, to make the most impact.
Right. And I imagine that even just like hearing your experience doing one versus the other, the crisis response versus building something together from scratch, and seeing your energy and talking about either, it sounds like there's a faster route to something that might be joyful, that might be optimistic, that might even make room for some levity and exploration and play in the latter scenario.
I mean, April, I'll use what you shared as an example, right? Your experience of not seeing families and the way you were raised represented in media, right? Normally, I would get called in when they've already made that show and it's getting bad results, versus bringing somebody like April in early to say, here's my experience and here's a new way to be thinking about these things. And I think at the core, I come from a family of educators. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, like what keeps me going? Because finding the joy is important. And also, this work right now is very hard
Mm-hmm.
and very depressing and debilitating at times. And I know we're focusing on the lightness of it, but I think the light and the dark live side by side. But I come from a family of educators, and I think ultimately that's the work that I do. Is like if people, it is that Maya Angelou quote: "If people know better, they'll do better." And I do feel like if we can get that education into folks, I just tend to be a practical optimist. I think if people can have exposure, have a relationship, and are open to that curiosity, we can do, much greater work in that way. But they need that education.
Very fair. And I'm curious, April, for you. So one of the phrases that I've heard you use in our past conversations is this idea of radical imagination, which I know ties into movements past and present, especially around like Black resistance and Black futurism and things like that. But I'm curious about what your world looks like and where you've found opportunities for that radical imagination. Like how do you foster it, not just for yourself, but for the people that you're working with, because it's similarly like a very partnership, collaboration driven model. But just bring us in a little bit to what it's like.
Yeah, for sure. So a couple of months ago, I had the opportunity with one of my colleagues to talk to a group of high school students who were in a program, and some were finishing out their high school career, others were about to move on to college, and just really like, what is it like to be a working professional? How'd you get here? Things like that. And so one of the things that I told them is everything is made up and none of this is real.
Spoiler.
And that's really what the radical imagination is about, is that when you really think about it, so many things that hold us up in terms of, you can think anything just in the context that we work, in terms of professionalism, how we should dress, how we should behave, the way that we speak. All of these things, it's just made up. Someone made it up at some point. It could be 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 2,000 years ago. It's all based on imagination. And so, given that all of that's made up, I see that we always have an opportunity to make up something new, particularly for ourselves. And so I really try to lean into that space. And sometimes the way that that shows up in work is really getting us to peel back the layers a bit about why we're here, why our work is necessary. How did these issues and these problems come to be? Because so often in the social change um, space, particularly when you're dealing with people and like the human experience, whether it's poverty or neighborhood revitalization, it's very easy to think that it's a habit of an individual versus a constellation of policies and practices over time created by other people. And so in that sort of radical imagination, again, it's wanting people to be curious about the problems that they see before them. Like, how did we get here? Why do they exist? And oftentimes they do, again, go back to a set of policies. So that means that if we have those policies that created this, that tells me we have an opportunity to create new policies, new practices, new ways of being. And so my role in narrative change and being a narrative strategist is really to help people open up that imagination for themselves. And again, going back to that curiosity. So one, coming to the issue from a place of curiosity, really wanting to understand like what was created, what was the impact, and how can we create something new and different. And I think in this particular area of work that I'm in right now around resident-centered neighborhood revitalization, when we met, I was working at the Frameworks Institute and got this big project. And at the time, the task was reframing intergenerational poverty and race. No small feat. And for me, how I came to that project, I am not necessarily a researcher by training, but my approach to communications and narrative, I think, has always been from the place of a social scientist, particularly sociology. So for me, going through that project, I wanted to know, well, first, when did poverty become racialized? People of color, Black Americans in particular, were still a fairly small percent of the population. But when you look at the news, you look at media, you look at policies, we have a very outsized lens pointed towards us, that we are the face of poverty and disenfranchisement. And I wanted to know, why is that the case? So before we can think about how do we frame or reframe intergenerational poverty, why is that the story to begin with? And so again, thinking about how small our population is, surely it was not always the case that Black folks were the face of poverty. And I know we're also talking about joy, but I also come from a place of realism and understanding that the bulk of this country and more globally, we as in Black folks are not necessarily anybody's primary concern, that the benevolence is not there. And so understanding that making us the face of this really harmful thing without explaining how it became to be an issue further disenfranchises us, further takes away our agency. And so with that reframing project, really exploring sort of the origins of poverty in this country. And so going back to things like, of course, the war on poverty, how those policies came about, the New Deal, you know, FDR's work, like all of these programs that were created to help other poor people who were not Black, and how those programs actually further harm Black folks because you think about things like Social Security. If many Black folks had domestic jobs or agricultural jobs, those were jobs that you could not actually take Social Security benefits. So, like seeing the generational impacts, and then you fast forward to sort of urban renewal and all of these other efforts that maybe had some good, but also other unintended consequences and also intended consequences. And so that's kind of where we are today. So for me, all of that, like for me, is a form of imagination and like tackling the problem differently. And so once we learn those insights from that research project, and the main one being that when you talk about poverty and you talk about race, you are ultimately reinforcing really harmful assumptions and ideas that people, even other people of color, already have about Black folks. And so if you're coming to people with a story that reinforces negative assumptions, there is no interest or will for them to be part of the change making and the problem solving. And you're just doing, as a storyteller, would be doing further harm. And so once learning that, really working with our partners to figure out what is a different story that we can tell that brings in the curiosity, the imagination, hope, resilience. It really, I think, shifts power from sort of this top down of like a nonprofit organization or a funder or the government even, and really puts that power back to the person who is living the day-to-day experience. And so one of the big transformations or shifts that we've made or are making, because we know new stories and new narratives take quite a bit of time to shift. If narratives are based on culture, it takes a long time to build culture, right? And so one of the big shifts that we're in the process of making is instead of leading with poverty, we're really advancing with prosperity. And what prosperity looks like is different for each person and for them to define. But prosperity is something that's more affirming than starting a story of like the harm that has been done to people, which is poverty. Because in that storytelling, when you lead with poverty, you're not talking about how poverty is created. That is an intentionally designed thing that we never unpack in our storytelling. But prosperity gives us space to talk about policy shifts, but it also gives us space for people to talk about what prosperity looks like for them. So in some communities, it might be they want safe, secure neighborhoods. It might be that they want a park. It might be that they want nice, even paved sidewalks. It might be that they want to gather in like multi-generational homes, all sorts of things, you know what I mean? So just making sure that in my work, I'm always trying to invite people, I hope, to be curious, to have that, like to exercise imagination, because sort of going back to my earlier point about being friends with you, our kid-like selves, we only have this small amount of time in our existence, right? To be imaginative, to be creative, to be curious. And if you think about being adolescence is such a small period of your life, and how sad is that we don't get to be fun or creative or imaginative, except for maybe 10 years in the scheme of like maybe a life of 70, 80, 90. You know what I mean? And so, yeah, so I really try to push that forward, and I've just found gratefully a way to do that professionally as well as personally.
That is incredible. There's so many gems in what you just said. In the first place, it's helpful for me to hear, and I hope for others to hear, that's holistic description of what we mean by radical imagination. Because when I was coming into social impact, and even more recently, as I'm like learning every month, I'm just I think most people, I was chatting with somebody who had just hired an intern who had like a degree in social impact that she was like, because we're just so used to like, we're using our skills and surveying the landscape and doing what we have to do. So I feel like I'm always in a state of learning. But particularly when I was newer to the space, when I heard a phrase like that, with all of my internalized bias, to your point about what sounds legitimate, and and like what sounds like the right way to approach something versus what you could judge as like more frivolous or more abstract, I struggled with the word imagination. I was like, why are we using the word imagination? I feel like it's not going to hold weight in the spaces that we need it to, given all that's going on. But when I understand it and hear it described this way as a tool to subvert norms, and you're doing like for like, the norm was dreamed up, so why can't the new norm be dreamt up? That's a totally different thing, and then I can see it as a very, very pointed and powerful culture change tool, like apparatus.
Yeah, and one of the things I say to people as part of that imagination and things being made up is if you really sit with yourself, like none of us are actually happy doing those norms anyway. So why not be a little brave and a little like creative and courageous, honestly, is to try the thing that might bring us joy, and create new norms out of that. Because I think we see it all the time. We've seen it, of course, more recently with the pandemic. And I think we're seeing it right now that in our rush to get back to normal, we're all kind of crashing right now because it was too soon just from a place of health and everything else with the pandemic, but also that way of existing before. Like, this is my, of course, personal opinion. People may feel very differently. I think in a past life, I was also a cat because I do love leisure. So that's part of it too, is that like, why are we always so busy all the time? Well, let us just sit for a moment and like feel the sun rays.
Yeah. I just want to sit in this sunbeam.
Yes, exactly. But yes, we're like in that rush to get back to normal. We all went through a collective traumatic event, right? And we've had multiple collective traumatic events, like you named, starting this work 2016. Similarly, I moved to DC October 2016 and had to find myself in our nation's capital in a new environment, observing other people have to face like what is their home no longer feels like their home, on top of all the other, again, my personal opinions, like the trauma of like that time, and then moving into all these other collective traumatic events. It is really difficult to experience that emotionally, physically, mentally, and still go to work every day. And then also work in a space where you're having to support other folks who have it worse than you do. Like, I'm in a very privileged and fortunate position. And it's really hard sometimes to like navigate what I'm dealing with, but also know that there is this larger purpose. And then if we can do right by the people who have historically and consistently been disenfranchised, we actually all win, you know? And so I'm really hoping that like, as we're starting to realize the consequences of rushing back to the norms too fast, that the next step will be people want to be imaginative. During the pandemic, everyone's baking bread and like they're starting a garden.
It's true. We all coped creatively to an extent. Watching Tiger King, cooking, taking up a new hobby,
Yeah,
taking a
exactly.
virtual class, a virtual dance party. It's very fair.
We adapted. And so I think like, can we use that in this new moment as we're like seeing what, there's a lot of other issues still going on, but can we take some of those lessons and like the gift of adaptability that exists in us as humans and carry some of those joys and like the new ways of imagining our existence forward to whatever's next for all of us.
Absolutely. And something else I heard in both what you said and what Jess said was this connection and reconnection to youth. So April, you're going very intentionally back to the inner child, kind of like referencing that a lot. And then Jess, I think it's significant that a lot of your work now that changes perceptions among adults is done through the vehicles of children's spaces and toys and brands, And I just wonder if there's something in there that creates that permission. And it also makes me think about, not all social impact work today is grassroots led and oriented. But when you do think about grassroots movement making, it's often driven significantly by youth. And so it just makes me wonder about, is that a place to start for those of us doing this work who sometimes feel like there isn't that much space created to lead with levity or joy, is going back to a youthful space or being in partnership with people who either are young or who are connected to that spirit within themselves and in that work, a place to start.
Yeah. It's so interesting because in my space in marketing and advertising, right, we're all often talking about the demographics that we want to reach. And there's like 1,000,010 PowerPoints about Gen Alpha, Gen Z, and millennials and boomers and what makes us different and what brings us together. And you're right, like in a very weird way. And also I'm somebody who's chosen not to have children in life. And I work for
Mm,
like the largest like companies who impact childhood. But
mm,
I don't think one precludes the other, but I think it's interesting for me because in that space, I may not have an in my household example of raising and growing, another human being, but I'm certainly an auntie and a mentor and a teacher and have been connected to young people and keep that young girl of myself there, like we've all been talking about. But it's interesting when you do talk about the origin of where identities get built and stereotypes get promoted and the systems that promote them largely are educational systems. If you're looking at I work a lot in the beauty and body image space, and I'll have so many parents say, "Oh, we were so deliberate about not talking about beauty and body image in a certain way." And then, boy, my daughter turned 5 and she went to preschool and she came home and now she talks about, is she fat and is she pretty enough and she wants to look like this person. So you can't stop culture and society from creeping in that space. And what I like about working with youth culture and actually specifically working with my brand partners who service young people and families is we often really reinforce for our clients the childhood piece is not done for the parents, right? They're working through generational traumas they're trying to undo, new value systems they want to raise their families in. And I
wow.
think what we try to find is the connection between the 4-year-old and the 40-year-old or the 45-year-old, because as we're already sharing, in a lot of ways, they're not that different. It's just that in April, I thought you made such a good point about we only have this sort of limited lifespan that we're given to play with permission, I'll say, by culture, right? And then you have to kind of get serious and do all the adult things. But when you're talking about social impact in families and kids, what I'm really conscious of is I don't want to bum out the parents raising kids in this culture today, right? I want to be additive and not reductive because I can't, Surgeon General just came out talking about the mental health state of parents and particularly right now,
I saw that.
and it's like, and
Hmm.
we've been hearing that about kids. And so I think in my modality, I'm constantly not, I love the imagination piece of it because I agree we can recreate narratives and messages and I also think people can't always learn and change and grow from a place of feeling like um so wary and beaten down and feeling like helpless in that way. And I think social media has accelerated the way that we consume information, and it's certainly a place where we can feel more isolated than connected at times. And so, as I think about all the levers I could pull with marketing and advertising to connect to people, I always have to kind of keep in mind, right? Like, what's the through line at the end of the day? And what will somebody enjoy doing so that they want to come back and do it again?
Mm,
Because I think, and obviously maybe the space and the partners they work with lend themselves to more play and content and creativity in that way. But ultimately, that's a balance to strike. We want to be making change all the time, and we want our stakeholders, like the families we market and talk to have different conversations and make different purchases and think about the world differently. And then how do we invite people into play with us to do that? And it's not just, again, like a one and done, as we're talking about. There's systemic barriers, and then there's personal barriers, and there's cultural and media barriers. So it is, again, that ecosystem of complexity. But I don't know about you all. I couldn't stay doing this though if I didn't create some world of play and imagination and creativity in my personal life and in the rest of my life off these, meetings and conversations. That's been something I feel more and more acutely as I live and grow in the world.
Completely agree. Completely agree. There are different moments. I feel like in my own experience, sometimes I'm just like, oh God, like what, like what's happening? But for the most part, the overwhelming majority of the time, somehow paradoxically, even just reading my own behavior, I am more optimistic. Like the deeper I go, or I'm more committed to optimism, I'll say. Like even creating a space, like issue space, like why?
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because it feels good. Because I think that folks doing this work deserve to feel good and to be in community and get that high, of affirmation, of shared storytelling space. So I really agree with that. And I'm even, as you were talking, I was kind of going through my head, like, I don't think I know. I don't think I know. I don't think I'm close to any person in social impact who doesn't have some sort of a creative practice,
Mm-hmm.
whether in their role or in their personal life or both. There is some creation, play, imagination aspect of their lives. They do a craft, they take a class, they perform, they dance, like truly just going through most of the people that I'm close with. And it seems like even subconsciously, there's that commitment to feeling alive and vibrant, maybe because you are constantly reminded of the fact that if you're in a position of privilege as we are, it's a choice. If we're not the most vulnerable, then you can choose to lean into the lighter, brighter sides of life and do it with even more gratitude. We're recording this in early fall 2024. So we're seeing all of the election content. And it's like, I mean, at this point, I feel like we're just so sure, like we're so unfazed by like the circus of it all. We're like, great. But it really is kind of hysterical that the current political strategy is like trolling and just like picking at each other. I mean, you drive people to a point, but you see like jokey press releases and like stuff from official social media from, elected officials, official social media that you would not have seen in elections past, just leaning into like culture and poking fun and things like that. But in our space, which always kind of intertwines with whatever the political moment is, I still think that there's a lot more conservatism. So when I'm thinking about like programs run by nonprofits, or kind of funded by foundations, when I'm thinking about brand work, you don't necessarily see a lighter tone. And I think there's a lot more caution, just probably related to your world. Like there's a desire not to offend, there's a desire not to screw up in a embarrassing and expensive way. But I'm just curious, like, what do you think stops more of us from putting our hand up and saying like, I think there might be like a different way to do this? Like even April and what you were sharing, I was reminded of the solutions journalism movement, where there are publications who are like, we only publish solutions journalism, like we're not going to lead with doom and gloom. We're going to lead with, did you know this is possible? And then, kind of offer the doom and gloom as a context, but it's not the clickbaity sort of approach. And like that was lots of somebody's choice to be like, we're going to go out on a limb and do things a little bit differently from how people are used to seeing these things discussed. But because we believe in this approach that leads with a more optimistic or a more constructive take. I'm just curious, like in each of your worlds, like, do you observe people taking those risks? Do you observe what it feels like from the outside, which is that there's an aversion to those risks? When have you felt most empowered to take a different approach? Just curious.
Look, I mean, as a consultant and a strategist, I'm unapologetically progressive around the issues that I'm looking to move forward. And so I think the clients that choose to engage with me, and I feel very proud about the long-standing relationships I've had. You mentioned that in the beginning, 2 decades with the brand, 15 years with the brand. That's many people's they turn over. I'm working with different CEOs. Like the fact for me to maintain those relationships means that I've shown up authentically about what I care about, the issues that I care about, and I'm unwavering in that.
That's true.
I'm reasonable and I meet people where they are, but I think people know when they're choosing to work with me as a strategist, I'm coming in to progress on the side of equity and inclusion and so I have very clear, I would say like guardrails, not always like guideposts. It's not like an end goal all the time. And where we're going to get there is different, but I know that like we have to travel in a certain manner of progression. And so I will say to put us where we're talking today, it is really unusual, right? Separately from my consulting work, I also serve on the national board for a wonderful organization called She Should Run, which is a nonpartisan organization that helps women reconsider their opportunity to run for office and hold civic leadership in various levels of government, not only in federal or but in state and in community roles. And it's really kind of tapping the next generation of leaders. And obviously, with the step change currently, as we're talking around the optimism and joy and enthusiasm around Kamala, and I think a little bit in the chaos and trauma that we've all been accustomed to live under with he who I shall not name because I cannot do that, is just, it would feel like other people would be picking that up and be optimistic. And actually, I'm finding people are quite bullish right now. And people being like my clients and corporate entities, and bullish for a number of reasons, right? Obviously, as you mentioned, nobody wants to get in the crosshairs of a media controversy right now. The way the news cycles go so hard and fast, and crisis comms folks are just on speed dial right now because there's just a tremendous amount of misinformation and also just a fast-paced, non-research, not solutions-based approach, right? So the corporate ethos, right, could typically be, well, I'm just going to take a step back and I'm just going to wait this out. What I'm finding I'm doing right now with my clients is really advocating for not doing that. And I'm not asking them to get in, and they don't need to endorse anybody publicly, but internally, if you've stood for women, you've stood for families, and you've marketed to these communities, then you need to stay true to that mission and find the ways that you can continue to help. Like what I want people to do is think about like all gas, no brakes right now, because I think we're at a really crucial time. And so people who've been stakeholders in making change when it's been more convenient for them cannot stay silent right now, cannot go within. And I understand wanting to be conservative and not getting, caught up in a scandal, but I'm trying to help them fortify their inner DNA right now, right? Like, how do you, because that matters to the people who work for these companies. This matters to just the long-term believability of a brand in this space, to not just dip in and dip out when it's convenient, which is a big part of the corporate washing and the greenwashing and pinkwashing and stuff that we talk about a lot in the issue space.
Mm.
But when I do this work, and what I really want to share for this conversation is that is a person to person job that I'm doing right now. I can't go into corporation X and take it on as a whole systemic entity. I'm working on leader to leader. How do I get them to stay true to the vision of where we started this work, regardless of what might be happening in the cultural conversation, let's say around election right now. And then there's a lot of personal planning, right? Like, what happens if this outcome happens? What happens if this happens? Like, because what I want them to also do is be prepared with their point of view. So it's interesting because the currency that I'm working in right now is like advocacy and accountability and consulting, like almost executive to executive, because if a leader says, okay, well, we're not going to say anything about the election, and I'm like, nah, 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 nah. Like, let's take a step back. Where can we speak? Where can, to April's point, like, start to change the narrative? Don't wait, right? If you're going to lead. But that requires personal courage. That requires curiosity, a sense of safety, a sense of permission. And so
Yep.
it gets really interesting right now to, again, going back to learning modality, I want people to also feel like it's doable and reachable, and we can do it in small steps. We don't have to take large leaps, right? But we have to keep the momentum. And that's where I'm finding a lot of conversation right now, because I think we need to, and I think we need to know who the helpers still remain being. And, with the pullback of DE&I investments, I've had tons of programs and in nonprofits that I work with have funding pulled. I've had programs pulled. I'm looking for the brands that are coming forward and saying, we're not pulling off of that, right? I'm going to stay committed and I'm going to weather that. And again, that takes some moral courage on the inside. And it truly is an inside job before we ever hear about it in a press release.
Ooh, to be a fly on the wall. Yeah, some of those one-on-ones. How about you, April?
Yeah, in hearing you speak, Jess, one of the things that's coming to mind is that, we all, no matter, I think, people's political affiliations, I think the bulk of people want to live in a really beautiful world where they do not have to worry. And I think some degree of that they extend to the people around them as well. But none of those things happen on accident. And I think that's the part that a lot of folks are missing right now. That inclusion, a beautiful, just society does not happen just because there's another day checked off the calendar, right? Like progress is not a natural progression, if that makes sense. And if we want these things, we have to work towards these things. We have to fight for these things. We have to believe in them and we have to advocate for them. And I think sort of my observation or assumption based on the current trend is a lot of the lessons that we've learned about the impacts of policies and practices, or even like stories that have been told, is still relatively new information. You know what I mean? That like policies that were created 40, 50 years ago, we're just now seeing the impact of some of them. I would say that a lot of organizations have the opportunity to really be reflective about their values and their purpose and their mission in this political context, because what we do today is not only affecting us today, but it will affect what needs to happen 4, 5, 15, 20, 30, 40 years down the line. And we don't want to look back 40 years from now and say like, oh, that thing that we had a chance to fix or change, actually, that just furthered harm. You know what I mean? There's always going to be some element of, we don't know all the things, right?
Right.
If we want to see something much more positive and better than what we're seeing today, we got to work on it today. You know what I mean? Because again, those candidates that were fringe 30 years ago, they're mainstream because we didn't give real attention to them. And we assume that like, surely people would figure out that like, they're not serious, but they've been speaking to people and rallying their base over time. And I'll just like end with, I think this again is why I love narrative so much, in narrative from the perspective of not just what do people need to know, but why do they think what they think, and how is culture influence and inform that? Because in very simplistic terms, that means that we have the power and the potential to, again, tell those new stories to help people better understand not just my experience, your experience, but their own experience. You know what I mean? Like, if you are having to work multiple jobs and you cannot feed your family, that is not because of immigration, you know? And it is very easy to say that it's this one scapegoat, but like that creates so much harm. It creates so much violence. It is not a good and comfortable place to be in, to say the very least. And again, no one is getting full off of having that degree of hate in them. Like no one's life is better because they hate someone else that they think is the reason for like their own disenfranchisement. So those of us who are in this privileged position to tell different stories or to be policymakers or just social change advocates, it's not just about the story we tell, but like that trickles down to people's actual lived experiences on both ends. And I just really would like for us all to be really courageous. I've been some mild degree of diplomatic by not naming names, but hopefully people get my point. But I really hope folks who are listening can lean into that courage that is required for us to move ahead. Because again, like our survival, I think, as we saw with the pandemic, is dependent on all of us working together and showing up for one another,
Absolutely. And I appreciate a spirit that both you and Jess have held true throughout this conversation, which is that, yes, it is about the vision and the joy and the expansiveness, but never out of the context of what's going on right now and what the domino effect is going to be in the future. Always, always. It's like head in the cloud, but feet on the ground.
Yes, I
Like
love
we
that.
kind of like, and we can go get to a joyful space and we can work from a joyful space. But the reason it keeps coming back to that serious anchor is because it's only going to actually manifest in a tangible, positive outcome in people's lives if we're not being imaginative for imagination's sake, if we're doing it always with an eye to who we're trying to help.
That is one of the downsides to the self-care movement is it's like we already live in a very individualistic society. And so when you talk about self-care, yes, it's self-care is needed, but it's really being pushed to like for you and you alone. And that doesn't do a whole lot for the collective, right? And so like I appreciate your point, Kat, about sort of impact space really is about we recognize what we need for ourselves, but it is always tied to the broader group that we're trying to make this change for.
Mm-hmm. And it doesn't make you happier. There's a loneliness epidemic. Every other year, there's another epidemic. So we don't really like talk about it, but like fully, and I want to say like 2018, the last Surgeon General's warning was that there was a loneliness epidemic, So yeah, I think that's a really wonderful reminder that you can also cultivate joy by staying rooted in community. Um, I am so grateful for today's conversation. I want to wind us down. I have options for your sign off. You can answer all of them. You can answer one of them. You can answer a couple, but just things that I know that folks are curious about. So one is, how do you sustain yourself in this work, given all of the toll and the time and just it's hard, if you have specific ways that you care for yourself, that you sustain yourself, that you're able to re-energize and get the energy and purpose that you need to come back the next day, we'd love to hear it. Another is if people just took away one thing from this conversation about the lighter side of change today, what would you want it to be? And then another is if you have anything that you're working on that you want the issue space community to know about, you're welcome to share it with us.
I think if there's one thing I would want somebody listening to continue to think about after this conversation is kind of where we maybe started in our connection piece, which is the recognizing the childlike humanity, innocence, imagination, and possibility that we all really still contain inside of our adult bodies, walking around trying to do this work, and how we tend to that with each other and with ourselves, I think is what I'll call the work of the work, because my ideas, my support, all of that is only as good as well as I'm feeling and as well as I'm being supported and fed into it as well. I would say there are a couple of things that ground me. I'm a huge animal lover. I have 5 animals at home.
What are the animals?
3 cats and 2 dogs and a husband. But for me, the animals are a complete, I mean, I think animals are so much better than humans in so many other ways. But I love spending time with them. I love being out with them. I love just kind of that actually really does ground me. I think I do a lot of somatic work as well because I'm a heavy, high feeler and need to have a physical process. So exercise of various ways. I box so I can address my aggressive side. I Pilates to ground, I stretch, I strength train, and I actually have made emotional metaphors for when I do that work for myself because I feel like it represents like I'm well beyond exercise as punishment. For me, exercise is life. Like if I am not moving, stretching, building, like I'm not fluid and I'm not flowing as well as I get massages when I can, or I have invested, and even in my business, because I'm my own entrepreneur business, I have a line item in my P&L for the wellness care, not just for me, but for my team as well. We have wellness stipends. We work 4.5-day work weeks. There are, philosophies for me that's like about like a physical release and an emotional release. So I would say it's a lot of those things, and as many as I haven't been able to do all of them my whole life, but I am at a very awesome space in my career where I can invest in that and invest in that for the people that I work with. And then I would say relationships for me, not only are they the currency of business, but they're what makes me tethered to my community. My husband is an incredible partner in my life. I met him later in life. So we come together very intentionally in our marriage and our relationship and make sure that we center, we got married around 7 core values that we share with each other that we review as we've gone through our
Wow.
time. We're coming into 11 years of marriage. So when we got celebrated our 10th, we reviewed them, and all that does, not different from the work that we're talking about, is keep us curious, keep us connected, keep us communicating. And I feel very lucky to have that kind of relationship in my life now. And so that is a huge through line for me in staying sane and joyful and playful, as we do the hard work.
That's beautiful. Should we all rush out and get marriage values? I'm so impressed.
It was pretty fun. And you know what? It just gave us our own roadmap together versus like adopting what our families, we come from very different backgrounds. And because we got married a little later in our life, I was 40 when I got married. I had just lived enough to kind of know this is not my Hallmark movie. This is like what it's going to take to partner with another human and like walk the world together. And my husband and I share 2 different languages and 2 different cultural backgrounds. And so a lot of this has just been like the intentional, what do we share? And then how do we build a life around those shared values?
That's beautiful. Thanks for sharing it with us.
For sure.
I'm going to be the next one who talks to Jess because that's so good. I love all of that and super resonant for me right now. I think as I'm approaching 40, and I love family, I love kids, but it's not exactly my personal ministry, And I think, of course, again, the conversation that's in the media right now in politics about childless when I don't have cats. So I'm probably even more of a deviant in some people's eyes. But yeah, kind of like faced with like, what does this stage of life mean, and what is sort of the next growth period, I think, for me. But just in terms of like, I think cultivating joy, maintaining joy, and really preserving myself to do this work for the long haul is a few things. One, I am, like I said, probably a cat in a past life. I love to wander. If it took me a long time to get to a place of structure, and I'm still not super great at it because I just like the experience of existing in the world. And sometimes structures, calendars, to-do lists, meetings, all of these things sort of restricts that. But like when I can, I will try not to have a destination and I will just roam. So even in the work that we've been doing around neighborhood revitalization, when we visit neighborhoods, I always have my phone ready and I am taking pictures of all the things I see. That it's not just the murals, right? But it might be some broken piece of glass that I found in the ground, or some bottle cap that happens, some kind of like Pepsi challenge or some kind of thing, right? That has a phrase, but just all of those things just, I think, help connect me to the world and really, again, making me curious about like what was here before me. Um, and something, if you talk to any of my friends, they will say that I love to talk to strangers. And there's still a bit of that shyness in me, right? But I just love a stranger. And like one of my good friends will always say, people tell you the strangest things. And it's because honestly, it comes from a place, I think, I'm just asking a question. You know what I mean? That like, I think to your point, Kat, about we're in a loneliness epidemic. And again, humanity only thrives if we're in it together, right? And so I think so much has been lost, and like, and understandably so. Like we're all trying to preserve, and sometimes the instinct is to retreat into ourselves. And I have to force myself sometimes to push back against that. And one of the ways that I do that is engaging with other people. You know what I mean? That like, I think especially as someone who does not have my family that I have like sort of like crafted in a nuclear sense, that I have a bit more openness and I have to be more intentional about not just what family looks like, but what my community looks like, who my friends are, and those sort of things. And so that really starts with like just being curious and asking other people around me, what's going on with them, and I don't get that invasive, but it could be anything at all, just acknowledging their presence, that opens the window for me to just again realize that I'm not out here alone by myself, that there's a whole wide, beautiful world out there. It brings me a lot of joy. And that's one of the ways that sort of it gets re-energized to do this and to do it for the long haul.
That's beautiful. What a way to live. We should all have multiple animals, relationship values, joy and play, and a commitment to being pragmatic. Those are my takeaways. Oh, thank you both so much, April, Jess. Thank you so much for a beautiful conversation.
Thank you.
I hope, community, that you found it insightful as I did. You can learn more about Issue Space and find this episode and other goodies at issuespacemedia.com. We hope you'll be a part of our community, and we'll see you next time.